The final payment went through at 4:06 p.m. on a Thursday. Kaylin Murray sat at her kitchen table laptop, opened the online banking confirmation glowing like a quiet monument. 14 years. That's how long it had taken. 14 years of steady checks, winterside jobs, canceled vacations, secondhand coats, and careful spreadsheets. 14 years of being the one who made it work even when no one asked her to. She took a breath soft and full and let the silence wrap around her like a well-earned coat. She thought just for a moment of buying herself a cake. Nothing fancy. Maybe a vanilla layer from Landry's bakery down the block. She'd write a little card, paid in full. Maybe stick it on the fridge with the dog-shaped magnet her mother hated. The thought made her smile. Then her phone rang. Kaylin didn't recognize the number at first. Landline. Local code. She already knew. It was the voice that confirmed it, crisp and clipped in that way her mother always used when she was about to say something offensive with sugar on top. Kaylin, your brother's taking your place. There was no hello, no build-up, no apology. Deborah Morey went on as if reading a grocery list. He's coming back next week. He needs stability now. You've had your time here. We'll need you to clear the basement so we can make space for him. He'll be staying in your room, but his things need storage. Kaylin stared at the glowing bank confirmation still open on her screen. Her hand didn't move. Her voice didn't rise. She had once tried to fight her mother. Once. At 19. Over a prom dress. It hadn't ended well. Now, at 37, she knew better. Now she wielded silence like steel. Noted, she said. Just that. A pause followed. A scoff. The click of her mother hanging up. Kaylin placed the phone down gently beside her mug. Her tea had gone cold. Outside late March, winds pressed against the kitchen windows, soft and slow like a warning. She reached forward and closed the laptop. They always thought silence meant submission. They were wrong. Kaylin Morey had lived in the basement of the house on Waverly Street for most of her adult life. It hadn't always been a basement. When she first returned from college, it was a cement box with a leaky sink and spiders in the corners. She turned it into a studio apartment over 2 winters, using her tax refunds and weekend contracting gigs. She paid to have it insulated. She retiled the bathroom. She replaced the water heater with her own savings. Every repair, every update, every new fixture was logged in a folder labeled Morey Property, Personal. Not that anyone ever asked. She moved back after her father lost his job in 2009 and the bank threatened foreclosure. At 21, with student loans just beginning and job offers still out of reach, she stepped in. She offered to help with the mortgage temporarily. They agreed to add her name to the deed to make it fair. That was the last time fairness had ever been mentioned in that house. 14 years later, she was still paying. Her parents stopped contributing 5 years and saying retirement left them tight. Kaylin had never been tight. She just lived like it. She gave up weekends. She declined office parties. She skipped 3 weddings and 2 vacations, all so that the payments would never fall behind. And now Jace was coming home. Jace, who left at 22 in a blaze of cigarettes, stolen cash, and a shouting match with their father. Jace, who called maybe once a year, always needing something, always angry. Jace, who hadn't lifted a finger or sent a single dollar in support while she'd been hauling grocery bags up the porch and shoveling snow at 5 a.m. Now he was taking her place. The absurdity didn't even sting. Not yet. It hovered like a smell in the walls. Familiar. Faint. Permanent. Kaylin stood up and stretched her arms slowly as if testing gravity. She walked to the living room. The carpet still had a stain from the night the furnace leaked, a night she'd fixed it with duct tape and flashlight while her parents slept. She looked at the wall above the fireplace. A photo hung crooked Thanksgiving 5 years ago. She was in the corner holding the pie. Jace wasn't even in it. Yet if someone asked, her mother would say that was the last real family gathering. She walked past it into the hallway, past the coat closet whose door she had replaced herself. Then she stopped, reached for the drawer near the entryway, and pulled out the folder marked Morey Property, Personal. Inside were 14 years of receipts, labeled, highlighted, indexed. She sat down, opened a new email, and began typing a message to her attorney. Subject ownership clarification. because silence wasn't surrender. It never had been. The first winter was the worst. Not because of the snow, though it came down in sheets that year and iced over the front steps so thick Kaylin had to chip at it with the edge of a rusted shovel. No, it was the cold inside the house that stayed with her, the silence around the dinner table after she told them she was moving back in just until things stabilized. Her father barely looked up from his plate. Her mother had simply said, "Well, make yourself useful then." She had just turned 23. Fresh out of a temp accounting job in Concord that paid $11.50 an hour. No benefits, no security, but it was enough to start covering the late mortgage notices piling on the entryway table. You and her father had been laid off from the mill. Deborah was still working the church nursery twice a week, but it barely covered groceries. Kaylin hadn't planned on staying long, just long enough to keep the house from being repossessed. But the months turned into seasons, and the seasons began to pile up. By the second winter, she had moved into the basement. The upstairs bedroom, she was told, was still your brother's room. Jace hadn't been home in 2 years by then, but his posters were still on the walls, his dented duffel bag still in the closet. So Kaylin patched leaks in the cement floor, ran an extension cord from the upstairs outlet, and used an old oil heater to warm the space just enough to stop her breath from fogging. She picked up part-time gigs doing tax prep for local contractors, roofers, mechanics, the bait shop down on Lincoln Street. Word spread that she was quiet but sharp. The money came slow, but it came steady. There were days she wanted to leave, days when she stared at her bank account and thought about renting a studio over in Bow, maybe even Manchester. But each time she saw another envelope marked urgent foreclosure warning, she stayed and paid. Again. Year 4 brought a burst pipe under the kitchen sink. Her father sat watching TV while she crouched in an inch of water with a flashlight between her teeth and a wrench that didn't quite fit. When she finally got it clamped shut and the water mopped, Deborah had said, "You know your brother would have called someone. That's what men do." Year 6, she missed a close friend's wedding in Florida to pay the property tax bill that had crept up with the reassessment. She told herself it was fine, that the house was her responsibility now, that if she just kept going, someone would say thank you. They never did. Jace returned briefly during year 8. He needed bail money after a DUI outside Vegas. He called at 2 a.m. Kaylin wired $600 without telling their parents. When she asked if he was okay, he laughed and said, "You still doing the whole good daughter thing?" Then hung up. She never told them. They wouldn't have believed her anyway. She kept a folder Moray property, personal. Every receipt, every check stub, every email confirmation from the bank. It became a ritual. Finish a payment print, a copy, file it away. After a while, she stopped needing the acknowledgement. The paper was its own truth. Over time, the house changed. She redid the roof after a spring hailstorm, painted the porch railings a soft slate blue, installed new locks after Deborah forgot her keys 3 times in 1 month. None of it flashy, none of it expensive, but it kept the home standing, warm, livable. She learned to work through holidays. She stayed in during snow days. While friends posted photos of Maui or Charleston, she updated Excel sheets and scheduled pest control. She celebrated small victories with solo walks and library books and the occasional grocery store cupcake eaten quietly in her car before going back inside. No one ever called her selfless. That would have required someone to see her. Sometimes when she came home late from a long day of tax audits and consulting calls, she'd sit in the driveway for a minute watching the porch light flicker. The house never thanked her. But it stood, and that was enough. By year 12, her parents no longer even asked how the bills were paid. It was simply assumed the mortgage handled itself, as if the roof didn't stay over their heads because of her, as if the heat didn't hum on winter nights because she had quietly cut corners on her own groceries. Jace hadn't been mentioned in nearly 3 years, until the phone call, until Deborah's voice flatly declared him the rightful heir, as if the 14 winters Kaylin had spent keeping the house together were just a pause in someone else's story. She stared at the folder again. Moray property, personal, 14 years thick. She closed the drawer slowly. I didn't just pay off their house, she thought. I built their shelter. The office smelled like old carpet and lemon disinfectant. A plastic ficus stood by the door, its dust catching sunlight in a way that made it look somehow more real. Kaylin sat across from a woman in a slate-gray blazer, glasses perched halfway down her nose, fingers tapping keys with the precision of someone who didn't bother with small talk unless necessary. Miss Grenly was in her late 50s, wiry, no-nonsense. She didn't offer coffee, didn't ask about the weather. She clicked her pen and said, "You brought the documents." Kaylin slid the folder across the desk. 14 years worth. Receipts, tax forms, payment confirmations, maintenance invoices. I've highlighted the mortgage transactions and cross-referenced with the property tax records. Miss Grenly glanced at the label Moray Property, Personal. Her eyebrows raised slightly, a rare shift in her otherwise locked-in expression. She flipped through the first few pages, pausing only to skim Kaylin's original notarized inclusion on the deed in 2010. Added during the forbearance, she noted. My father was 6 months behind, Kaylin said quietly. The bank required a second name. I was working 2 jobs at the time, and neither of them have made a payment since 2013. I've covered every dollar since then. Quietly. Miss Grenly nodded once. So you paid off the mortgage, paid for all major repairs, and remain listed as co-owner. Kaylin nodded. But they assume it's still theirs. That I was just helping out. You weren't. Miss Grenly picked up her pen again. You were maintaining an asset you co-own. You've invested. You have documentation. And more importantly, they have no financial record of involvement for over a decade. Emotionally, this may be complicated. Legally, it's clean. Kaylin exhaled through her nose. Not relief exactly. She hadn't come here to be soothed. She came for facts. I want to file for sole ownership, she said. Miss Grenly didn't blink. Then we'll begin the transfer. I'll draft a quitclaim deed and a petition for title correction. They'll be notified and have 30 days to contest. They won't, Kaylin said. They don't even remember I'm on the title. My mother thinks this house is a family heirloom. It's not. It's a file number with a debt trail and my name stamped all over it. Miss Grenly gave the faintest trace of a smile. It's your name on the line and your money that got it here. They gave up claim the day they gave up contribution. Kaylin sat straighter. That one sentence, dry legal without ceremony, was more acknowledgement than she'd heard in 14 years. She signed the preliminary forms. The pen barely made a sound, but each stroke felt heavier than the last. A line between the life she'd been made to hold together and the one she was finally choosing for herself. As they reviewed the last few pages, Miss Grenly added, When this is finalized, you'll be listed as the sole legal owner. They can still live there if you allow it, but they'll be tenants, not decision-makers. Kaylin nodded. I'm not trying to throw them out. No, Grenly said, stacking the papers neatly. You're just reminding them whose roof they've been under. Kaylin didn't smile. She didn't need to. The paper did it for her. When she left the office, the late afternoon wind carried the smell of thawing dirt and wet pavement. March in New Hampshire never quite felt like spring, but it was trying. Kaylin paused outside, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The weight she carried hadn't lifted, not yet, but it had shifted. Now it had shape, boundaries, pages. She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, and typed 2 words, title transfer. For the first time in 14 years, she didn't feel like she was living in someone else's house. She was reclaiming what was already hers, on paper, and soon in practice. It was raining the day Jace came back, of course it was. Not a cinematic storm, not thunder or lightning, just that damp, relentless drizzle that clings to everything and makes even the driveway look like it's been crying. Kaylin heard the car before she saw it. A low hum pulling up to the curb tires, easing into the space she'd shoveled clean 3 mornings ago. She didn't go to the window. She didn't need to. She knew the rhythm of his arrival, late, loud, and undeserved. The same way he always showed up after a string of poor decisions and broken promises without apology and with just enough charm to get welcomed back. The front door opened with a too loud swing, and there he was, Jace Moray. 39 years old, same height as their dad, but leaner now, worn down in a way that didn't quite read as age, just erosion. His hair was longer, darker, maybe dyed. The goatee was new. He carried a beat-up duffel over one shoulder and held a Bluetooth speaker in his other hand, blasting something low and bass-heavy, a song Kaylin didn't recognize. He didn't look around, didn't pause, just walked in like he'd never left. Kaylin stood at the edge of the hallway, half in shadow, watching from the top of the basement stairs. Jace dropped the duffel on the floor, kicked off his sneakers without untying them, and made a beeline for the living room. He flopped onto the couch, set his speaker on the her coffee table, and put both feet up beside it like he owned the place. The cushions sank under his weight, the fabric creasing where she had spent years keeping it clean. Her mother was already fluttering behind him, voice high and warm, like she'd just won a prize on a morning talk show. "We're so glad you're home, sweetheart. Really. Just, finally." Her arms went around him and he barely moved. "We'll get your room back in order. You can sleep there tonight, and tomorrow we'll clear out the basement for your work setup." Work. Kaylin blinked. Since when had Jace had work? Her father emerged from the kitchen with a beer in hand, holding it out like an offering. "Welcome back, son." Jace cracked it open without a thank you. Took a sip and leaned back like he was sliding into a role he hadn't rehearsed in years, but still knew by heart. Kaylin stepped away from the stairwell back into the quiet of her basement apartment. She didn't slam the door. She didn't say a word. Upstairs, the music kept playing. Laughter followed. Muffled voices through old floorboards that had never quite been insulated right. She sat on the edge of her bed, hers paid in full with her first bonus check 6 years ago, and stared at the dent in the drywall where the space heater had once fallen. She remembered patching that wall on a Sunday morning while her parents were at church and the basement smelled like mold and resolve. Jace had been in Arizona then, or maybe Colorado. She'd stopped keeping track. Wherever he was, he hadn't been sweating over drywall mud or budgeting for winter insulation. He hadn't even called. She could hear her mother talking loudly over the speaker's thump. "You must be starving. I'll make your favorite those ribs you like. And I'll move Kaylin's boxes tomorrow. She's fine down here. She understands." That word again. Understands. Later that night, Kaylin was brushing her teeth when she heard her father's voice through the vent above the sink. Muffled but clear enough. "She'll understand," he said softly. "She always does." Kaylin stared at her reflection. Her mouth was still full of foam, her hand frozen mid-motion. The sentence rang out like a slap that didn't sting yet, just echoed. She always does. That was their biggest mistake. Because she had. For years. She had understood when her room became Jace's memorial, when her promotions were called luck, when holidays were canceled last minute for budgeting while her brother flew in from God knows where with designer sunglasses and a new girlfriend every visit. She had understood when her birthdays were forgotten but his missed calls were sacred. She had understood when she gave and gave and gave and they didn't even bother to pretend it was equal. But understanding isn't forgiveness, and it sure as hell isn't agreement. She rinsed, dried her hands, and returned to her desk. The folder was still there. Moray property, personal thicker now with the legal transfer in motion. The paperwork was dull and unglamorous. Black ink on white paper, signatures, dates, lines drawn between what was and what would soon be. She opened her laptop and checked the confirmation email from Miss Grenley. Title correction submitted. 30-day notice to co-occupants would be mailed the following week. Her finger hovered over the mouse for a moment before she clicked into the spreadsheet she'd been keeping, a quiet log of everything she'd covered in the house over the years. Roof repairs, furnace tune-ups, new dishwasher, all tagged, itemized, dated. Jace's name wasn't on a single line. Kaylin leaned back in her chair and looked around her space-plane walls, 3 lamps a rug with a wine stain she'd never quite gotten out. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, built on long nights and longer winters, and soon the house above would be hers too. Not just in secret, not just in silence, on paper, legally, undeniably. Upstairs, someone opened the fridge. Jace's voice low, annoyed. "Where's the damn mustard?" A drawer slammed. Kaylin shut her laptop. She didn't need to hear the rest. They'd made one assumption too many. And soon, they'd learn what she understood now. When you treat the person holding the roof over your head like they're replaceable, You'd better check whose name is on the deed." It took exactly one visit to the courthouse, one notarized packet from Miss Grenley's office, and one early Saturday morning at the hardware store. By the time the sun had fully risen over Waverly Street, Kaylin had already changed every lock on the upstairs doors. Quietly, legally, without ceremony. She started with the front door, replacing the worn brass knob with a digital keypad, keyless, programmable, and efficient, the kind used in rentals and short-term corporate housing. Then she moved to the side door, replacing the outdated latch with a modern deadbolt and installing a code panel above the handle. The back patio already had a smart lock she'd installed herself 2 years earlier, back when she still thought being helpful might someday earn her a thank you, but she rewired it anyway. Not because it didn't work, but because she needed to know without a shred of doubt that every point of entry was now hers to control. As she worked, the morning air was cold but dry, and a few birds chirped in the neighbor's pine tree like it was any other weekend. No one in the house noticed she was on the roof briefly to check the attic vent. No one noticed her in the garage resetting the keypad to a new access code. They were too used to her being invisible, to things just working. But today, they'd learned that working didn't mean waiting, and silence didn't mean permission. Her mother noticed first. Deborah came back from church just after 10, tugged at the front door like it had betrayed her. Kaylin was in the living room folding a blanket when she heard the initial rattle of confusion, then the sharper knocks 3 in a row, hard and irritated. Kaylin opened the door with complete composure. "We've lived here 35 years, Deborah said, storming past her like she owned the air. She clutched her purse like a shield, her shoes still damp from the church steps. "What is this keypad nonsense?" Kaylin didn't flinch. She handed her a typed sheet, single-spaced, stapled. A formal notice of sole ownership signed by both Miss Grenley and the county registrar. It was clean, factual, clinical. Deborah didn't read past the second line. "You changed the locks, I updated security," Kaylin replied. "As sole property owner, I have the right." Her mother scoffed, dropping the paper on the entry table like it was contaminated. "You're making a statement." Kaylin tilted her head slightly as if examining the words before speaking. "No, Mom. I'm making a boundary." That evening, Kaylin packed her things not to leave, but to move. For 14 years, she had kept her life folded into the basement like a backup plan. She had lived beneath them physically and symbolically, taking up the least space possible while shouldering the most responsibility. Now, she unrolled the rugs she had stored, unpacked the books she'd sealed in bins, and carried her life quietly without asking into the master suite upstairs, her old bedroom. The one she gave up for Jace when she was 23, the one that had been painted over in gray blues he never liked, then sat mostly empty for a decade. The one her parents insisted was still his room, even as Kaylin paid the heating bill every winter to keep it warm. She made the bed with new sheets. She set her books on the shelves where his trophies used to sit. She placed a lamp on the nightstand and turned it on just to watch it glow. Jace came home late. The speaker was thudding from inside his backpack, some track pulsing with bass. He didn't notice anything was different until he stepped into the living room and saw Kaylin's laptop open on the coffee table. His feet stopped mid-step. "You're in my spot," he said, tone low and edged with disbelief. Kaylin didn't look up. "You never lived here, Jace. You just dropped in." He blinked like he couldn't quite compute the challenge. Then he glanced down the hallway, eyes narrowing. "Is that my room?" "It was," she said. "Now it's mine again." He scoffed, dropped his bag to the floor like a child losing a game. "Mom said I could stay in the basement." "I moved out of the basement," Kaylin said evenly. "You can stay in the guest room if you ask." He didn't ask. He shouted, "You think you're better than everyone now, because you paid off a few bills." Kaylin stood finally. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. A few. Her parents emerged from the hallway, Deborah in slippers, Ewan rubbing sleep from his eyes like this was all too much to process. "She's being unreasonable," Deborah muttered to her husband as though Kaylin wasn't standing right there. "She's being ungrateful," Ewan said under his breath, but loud enough to land. That word, ungrateful, slid in under her ribs like a cold knife. Kaylin let it settle. Let it echo. Then she walked slowly to the center of the room where the light hit just enough to catch all three of them in her gaze. "I'm not asking you to leave," she said, voice calm, clear, unshakable. "I'm just telling you whose house this is." They didn't respond. Not right away. Deborah's mouth opened, then closed again. Jace shook his head like he was still waiting for her to break character. Ewan turned and retreated back to the hallway without a word. No one followed. Kaylin walked back to the master bedroom, shut the door behind her, and leaned against it, not because she was rattled, but because she wanted to feel the moment settle into her bones. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't defiance. It was declaration. She slept soundly that night. No footsteps overhead, no pipes clanging beneath, no echoes of expectation, just locked doors, and the knowledge that for once the space around her didn't ask her to shrink, and no one could take it, not without walking through a door they no longer had the code to. The knock came just after 10 in the morning. Not the frantic kind that signals emergency, nor the hesitant tap of someone uncertain about their welcome. Just 3 deliberate thuds measured confident and unmistakable, the kind of knock her mother used when she was coming not to ask, but to declare. Kaylin didn't need to check the peephole. She already knew. She opened the door with her coffee still in hand. Deborah Morey stood on the porch in a blouse ironed into stiff perfection and navy slacks that hadn't fit comfortably since the Bush administration. In her hand, a manila envelope clutched like evidence in a courtroom drama. Her lips were pursed so tightly Kaylin could see the creases cutting into her chin. "This has gone too far," Deborah said without preamble. Kaylin stepped back. "Come in." Her mother entered with the posture of someone reluctantly crossing enemy lines. She didn't sit. Instead, she hovered in the center of the living room like a judge inspecting a crime scene. Her eyes swept over the room, the geometric rug Kaylin had chosen during a Labor Day sale, the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf filled with accounting texts, memoirs, and poetry, the framed diploma from Syracuse above the mantel. Each item seemed to offend Deborah personally. "You've embarrassed this family," Deborah said finally. "Your brother came home to heal, to reconnect, not to be locked out and treated like a squatter." Kaylin took a slow sip of coffee, letting the steam fog her glasses slightly. "He wasn't locked out?" she said. "He was offered a guest room. He chose not to take it." Deborah shook the manila envelope. "We're looking into our options." "Legal options." Kaylin raised an eyebrow, entirely unfazed. "If necessary," her mother replied, though her voice dipped just slightly on the last syllable. Kaylin nodded once. She walked calmly to the side cabinet, opened the second drawer, the one with her organized folders and labeled sections, and pulled out her own envelope. It was larger, thicker. She placed it on the coffee table like setting a chess piece on the board. "Have a seat," she said. Deborah hesitated, then perched on the edge of the couch like it might bite. Her spine stayed straight as a rod. Kaylin sat across from her, unfolded the flap, and began. "This," she said, pulling out the top sheet, "is a certified copy of the deed. As of April 3rd, I am the sole legal owner of this house. It's been registered, signed, and notarized. You'll see the stamp and the county record number here." She slid it across the table, deliberately slow. Deborah stared at it but didn't touch it. These, Kaylin continued, placing a second stack beside the first, are payment records. Mortgage installments from January 2011 onward, property taxes, heating, oil, water, roof repair, pest control. 14 years of bills, all in my name, all paid by me. Her voice didn't rise. There was no anger, no venom, just arithmetic. Deborah's nostrils flared. "We raised you in this house." Kaylin nodded once. "And I kept it from being repossessed by the bank. Quietly, while you threw Easter brunches and told everyone Jace would move back once he found his feet." Deborah folded her arms. "We're your parents. We made sacrifices." "I'm not disputing that," Kaylin interrupted, holding up a hand, not harsh, just firm. "I'm just clarifying mine, for the record." She reached back into the envelope and retrieved her final exhibit. "And this," she said, unlocking her phone, "is the voicemail from 2 weeks ago." She tapped play. The room filled with her mother's voice, clear, clipped, cold. "Kaylin, your brother's taking your place. He needs stability now. You've had your time." Kaylin hit pause. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. "I recorded it," she said quietly, "because I needed to hear it again, without questioning if I imagined it." Deborah's cheeks flushed under her foundation. Her mouth opened shut, then opened again. No spin to apply. No apology offered. Kaylin didn't gloat. She leaned back slightly and clasped her hands together. "You've made it clear where your priorities are," she continued. "I'm not here to beg for recognition. I'm just here to make sure no one pretends this house was built by memories and intention alone. It was built on paperwork, on checks written, on work done at 2 a.m. during audit season so I could make the February payment when you were short on money after your cruise." Her mother's expression didn't soften, but something in her posture sagged, a subtle collapse like the wind had gone out of her sails. Kaylin stood, picked up her documents, and stacked them neatly back into her folder. "I'm not interested in revenge," she said. "I just want peace. The kind you only get when the truth is finally louder than the story people keep repeating." Deborah didn't respond. She rose slowly, more retreat than departure. She walked to the door and opened it herself. For once, she didn't slam it. Just stepped out, let it click behind her. Kaylin stood at the window and watched her mother descend the porch steps, envelope still gripped in her hand, unread. Later, as Kaylin rinsed her coffee mug in the kitchen sink, she spoke softly, not to anyone, just to the quiet. "They raised me to be quiet. Turns out, I listened, and built a paper trail while they were busy choosing favorites." She dried the mug, placed it back on the rack, and walked toward the sunlit hallway. The floorboards beneath her feet were warm, finished by her hands, sanded smooth one summer when everyone else was in Cape Cod. Outside, a breeze lifted the corners of an old welcome mat. A single red maple leaf skated across the porch like punctuation. They could tell their version of the story all they wanted, but Kaylin had the records, the receipts, the voicemail, the deed. And this time, she wasn't giving up her place. Not now. Not ever. The last of the snow had melted into gray slush a week earlier, leaving behind a yard that looked neither dead nor alive, just tired. Patches of brittle grass poked through like survivors after a long winter, still unsure whether it was safe to rise. The soil was damp and cold under Kaylin's boots as she stepped onto the back porch, the small bucket of birdseed nestled under her arm. The sky above was overcast, the kind of pale white that made everything feel paused, waiting. She had just unscrewed the lid of the bird feeder and begun refilling it when she heard the familiar groan of a gate hinge. Not loud, not urgent. Just that soft, deliberate creak like an old friend clearing its throat at the edge of a conversation. "Hope those blue jays don't scare off the finches," came a voice, warm, a little raspy, and unmistakably Edna Loring. Kaylin turned her head and smiled. There, leaning casually on the waist-high wooden fence that split their yards, stood Edna bundled in a red flannel coat that looked older than Kaylin, a pair of thick house slippers and a knitted wool cap in crooked stripes of green, gray, and blue. Her white hair peeked out beneath the brim, frizzy with the moisture in the air. She smelled faintly as always of cinnamon and something earthy like potting soil and patience. "They usually do," Kaylin replied, brushing sunflower husks from her palm. "But I like the commotion. Feels honest." Edna chuckled, folding her arms over the top rail. "Better than silence. That kind of silence, that one where no one sees what's really going on, that'll make you forget yourself." They stood for a moment just like that. Two women a generation apart, facing opposite yards, but aligned by something older and quieter. A light breeze stirred the dormant bushes by the porch steps. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and then fell quiet again. "I've been meaning to say something," Edna said after a long pause, her voice low and deliberate. "Been watching everything these past few months. Figured it wasn't my place. But I've lived too long to keep my mouth shut when something matters." Kaylin looked over, cautious but curious. Watching what Edna's eyes met hers, sharp and clear despite the web of creases that framed them. "I've watched you shovel snow in blizzards, Kaylin, not once or twice every year. Even that Christmas Jace came home. He stayed inside with that girlfriend in the puffer coat while you dug a path from the curb to the porch. You didn't complain, just did it." Kaylin's lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. I saw you carry 6 grocery bags up those front steps in the rain last spring. Your mama opened the door, said something about the roast being dry, then disappeared before you even made it inside. And those shutters, you painted them yourself. I offered you lemonade, you remember." Kaylin gave a small nod. "I told you I was on a work call. You said you had a 20-minute window to finish before a meeting. And you still smiled. Didn't even let on your wrist was sore." Kaylin let out a breath soft and tight. "They don't see it. They never did." Edna straightened slightly, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Oh, sweetheart, they chose not to. That's a very different thing." The words landed with a heaviness Kaylin hadn't expected. She felt her shoulders react before her mind caught up something uncoiling inside her, something too long buried under duty and silence. "You didn't inherit that house," Edna continued. "You built it. Not from scratch, no, but from what was left. I've seen you patch holes, seal windows, paint rooms, change locks, dig up the roots that were breaking the walkway. You turned that place from barely getting by to home. You made it livable, and you kept it livable." Kaylin swallowed hard, the wind brushing against her collar. "They like to talk about memories," Edna said, shaking her head slightly. "They like to point to old photographs and holiday meals and pretend that's the legacy. But I've been here just over this fence. I saw who showed up when no one else did. And honey, it was you." For a second, Kaylin couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, and she wasn't sure why the kindness hurt more than the absence ever had. "Thank you," she managed. Her voice was low, just above a whisper. "I don't know if I needed to hear that or if I just didn't realize how much I needed someone to say it out loud." Edna smiled gently, her eyes softening. "We all need witnesses. Even quiet work deserves to be remembered. Especially quiet work." They stayed like that for a while, the air between them light, and still the kind of silence that doesn't ache but settles. The sun began its slow descent behind the chimney stacks, casting long shadows on the porch steps. Edna pulled her coat tighter and adjusted her cap. "If they start making noise again trying to rewrite what you've done, you knock on my door, Kaylin Moray. I may be old, but I've still got a few strong words in me. And I'll remind them who kept that house standing when nobody else would." Kaylin let out a quiet laugh, one hand resting on the porch railing. "You'd scare them more than a lawyer." "Damn right I would." Edna turned and made her way back across her yard slippers, squeaking slightly on the wet concrete path. She walked with purpose, slow but steady. The kind of steady that comes from a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when to let someone finally feel seen. Kaylin stood on the porch for a long time after Edna disappeared inside. She looked back at the house, her house. Every room had a story. Every floorboard she'd repaired. Every light fixture she'd replaced. Not because anyone asked, because no one did. For the first time in weeks, something inside her unclenched. It wasn't pride, not exactly. And it wasn't vengeance either. It was recognition. And in that moment, recognition felt like a kind of peace. Sometimes you didn't need the whole world to see. Just someone across the fence who always had. On Monday morning, Kaylin stepped onto the front porch just after sunrise, coffee cooling in one hand, a laminated document in the other. The spring frost still clung to the edges of the yard, like it hadn't gotten the memo that the seasons had changed. A robin chirped from a power line above, and the wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and old pine. It was the kind of cold that bit more out of memory than temperature. The kind of morning she remembered from childhood, waking before school, helping shovel the driveway while Jace slept in. She walked down the porch steps, slowly, deliberately, her boots crunching softly on gravel. In her hand was a clipboard, clear plastic stiff-backed with a single sheet displayed prominently inside. She reached the wooden post near the front steps, the one just beneath the mailbox, and nailed the notice at eye level. The motion was practiced. Calm. Notice to vacate. Unauthorized occupants, as per RSA 540, a trespass notice issued under New Hampshire law. You have 7 days from issuance to vacate the premises or respond in writing to the legal property owner. Failure to do so will result in civil enforcement. That was it. No signature, no commentary, no softening language. Just the law laminated and posted like a quiet boundary drawn with steel. She went back inside and finished her coffee before the rest of the house stirred. But by breakfast, the fallout had begun. Her father's voice boomed from the foyer. "What the hell is this?" Ewan stood by the front door waving the clipboard like it was a summons to battle. His flannel shirt was still half-buttoned and his socks mismatched like he'd rushed out the moment he saw it. Kaylin didn't flinch. She sat at the kitchen table eating eggs slowly fork, scraping against the plate in measured bites. "It's a legal notice," she said calmly. "You have a week." Behind him, Deborah hovered in a quilted robe, arms crossed so tightly they seemed glued in place. "This is a scare tactic," she snapped. "Families don't put up signs like this. They don't call the law on each other." Kaylin looked up, meeting her mother's eyes with a steady gaze. "Families also don't erase the daughter who paid their mortgage and hand her bedroom to someone who hasn't lifted a finger. So let's not pretend we're still playing by family rules." From the hallway, Jace wandered into view, shirtless coffee mug in hand, like he'd woken just in time to enjoy the show. He leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "Do it," he said, voice lazy smug. "Evict your own flesh and blood. Let's see how it plays when you drag your parents out with cops and clipboards. Bet the neighbors'll love that." Kaylin didn't look at him. "It's not about how it plays," she said, voice flat. "It's about what's real." Jace raised his mug in mock salute. "You don't have it in you." She stood, gathered her plate, and walked it to the sink without a word. No reaction, no reply, only motion. The next morning, just after 8:40 a.m., a Navy sedan rolled up to the curb. No sirens, no fanfare, just the quiet presence of state authority. Deputy Krawczyk stepped out mid-50s, graying hair tucked under his hat, the kind of man who looked like he spent more time diffusing tension than escalating it. His shoulders were wide, but his face was gentle, softened by years of showing up to domestic disputes and boundary lines drawn too late. He rang the bell once. Kaylin didn't answer. She stood upstairs behind the edge of the curtain, watching through the front window. She didn't need to be in the room. She already knew what would be said. She had rehearsed it in her mind 100 times. Deborah opened the door. She gestured with one hand, her voice raised, not yelling but clearly pleading a case. Ewan appeared behind her, arms folded like he was expecting to intimidate someone. Jace lingered in the shadows of the hallway, never coming fully into view. Krawczyk didn't argue. He didn't escalate. He handed over the envelope, nodded politely, then turned and left without a single word wasted. Kaylin let the curtain fall back into place. The deputy's cruiser rolled away quiet as it had come. The porch was still again. Upstairs, the bedroom she now called her own was bathed in soft morning light. The slats of the blinds painted lines across the hardwood floorboards she had sanded, sealed, and stained herself 5 winters ago. She sat on the edge of the bed, her breath slow even. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't peace. It was resolve. That night at dinner, her father tried again. "You think this makes you strong?" he asked, voice lower now, laced with wounded pride. Pushing out the people who gave you life, Kaylin cut her roasted carrots into perfect pieces. "I'm not pushing," she replied. "I gave notice." "You decide what to do with it." Her mother set down her fork with a dramatic clink. What kind of daughter files legal action against her own mother? Kaylin stood calmly, placing her napkin beside her plate. The kind who's done being erased in her own home. She left the room, not waiting for the usual accusations or guilt-laced retorts. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches. She didn't owe them that performance anymore. She'd already said the most important thing in writing, backed by the law. The document still hung outside, still visible to anyone who approached the steps. No explanation necessary. Just truth. That night, she opened her journal and wrote only one sentence, bold and sharp in black ink. I wasn't evicting family. I was evicting entitlement. And for the first time since filing the paperwork, Kaylin slept soundly, knowing no one else had a key. They came on a Sunday afternoon, trickling in one by one, then in sudden waves. Kaylin noticed the first car before noon, parked slightly crooked against the curb. By 1:45, 5 more had joined it, 2 tires up on the sidewalk like courtesy didn't apply when bloodlines were involved. From behind the living room blinds, she watched it all unfold, the way you might watch a storm move in across an open field, slow, theatrical, and inevitable. Her mother had orchestrated this, no doubt. Probably made the calls sometime around Wednesday when her attempts at private persuasion had failed. Deborah Morey knew exactly how to build a narrative that would make Kaylin look like the ungrateful one, the cold daughter, the hard-hearted landlord with no loyalty and even less grace. By Sunday, the cast had shown up in full, ready to perform. Aunt Nadine arrived first, trailing the heavy scent of floral perfume like a warning flare. Then came Uncle Tim, his walk still stuck in a 1980s swagger, calling her kiddo, as though she hadn't paid every property tax bill since 2013. 2 cousins came next, sisters with diaper bags and toddlers in tow, giving Kaylin polite but uncertain smiles, the kind you wear when you're not sure if you're walking into a potluck or a battlefield. By 2:30 p.m., the house felt tighter than it had in years. People leaned on counters, filled the couches, hovered around doorways with coffee cups and cautious expressions. Some smiled too brightly. Others avoided her eyes entirely. Everyone seemed to know the script except Kaylin. Deborah clapped her hands, gentle but firm, the same way she used to get everyone's attention before saying grace on Thanksgiving. "Okay," she said, voice syrupy. "Let's just have a little family talk. Nothing formal, just a chat." Kaylin stood near the hallway arch, one shoulder resting against the wall, arms crossed. She wore jeans and a faded long-sleeved tee. No blazer, no statement. But she carried something no one else in the room had: the truth. Not the kind that raises its voice, but the kind that stands so still it forces others to fidget. "I think we all know what this is about." Nadine started smoothing her skirt like it might soften her tone. "Sweetheart, I just think maybe you're overreacting. This house, it's more than wooden walls. It's history. It's your brother's home, too." Kaylin didn't move. Uncle Tim stepped forward, next, his voice carrying that familiar, casual authority. "You've done a lot here, Kale. No one's denying that. But we were raised with a certain kind of grace. You don't file paperwork on your parents. You sit down, you work it out." Quietly, Nadine added, nodding. "With dignity." A cousin across the room spoke hesitantly. "We were just surprised. The sheriff. The notice on the post. It felt harsh." Kaylin let it all wash over her. The curated concern, the performance of unity. They came with coffee, and moral lessons like that could substitute for the 14 years she'd spent holding this house together while the rest of them disappeared. Deborah stayed silent, sitting in the armchair with her hands folded in her lap, fingers clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Her eyes darted toward Kaylin now and then, as if still hoping she'd break, that the pressure of being watched, judged, outnumbered, would finally force an apology. But Kaylin remained still. Her pulse didn't spike. Her jaw didn't clench. She didn't owe them a defense. Not anymore. And then, without a knock, the front door opened. Edna stepped inside with the slow grace of someone who knew she belonged, even if no one had asked her to come. She wore her best Sunday sweater, a pale blue wool button-up over a lavender blouse, and carried her purse looped over one arm posture, straight eyes clear. The room quieted instantly. Deborah blinked. "Edna, hi." "We weren't, I know," Edna interrupted, not unkindly. "You weren't expecting me." She scanned the room, pausing just long enough on each face to let her presence settle. When she landed on Kaylin, she gave a small nod, brief but grounding. Then she turned to the group. "I've lived next door to this family for 31 years, she said. "Long enough to know what gets said behind closed doors and what never gets spoken aloud." No one moved. "I've watched Kaylin shovel snow at dawn in January. I've seen her fix broken siding with her own hands. I've watched her haul groceries inside during thunderstorms and repaint shutters while half this family didn't return her calls. I saw her carry this house when it would have collapsed, if not physically, then certainly financially." Uncle Tim shifted his weight. One cousin looked down at her phone. "And I watched the rest of you show up for pie and holidays, then vanish when the roof leaked or the foundation cracked. You weren't here when the taxes jumped. You weren't here when her father stopped showing up, and you weren't here when her brother returned with nothing but expectations." Edna's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The strength was in her steadiness. "You think this house is yours because you remember it. She made it livable. She made it last, and that counts more than memory." Nadine cleared her throat as if to speak, but Edna raised a hand, silencing her with nothing more than a glance. "She earned this," she said, turning to Kaylin now. "Don't let them rewrite it." With that, she turned and walked out, no dramatic pause, no parting glare. Just the creak of the door as it closed gently behind her. The room stayed still for a beat. Then slowly, it began to unravel. Nadine tugged at the hem of her blouse. One cousin murmured something about needing to check the baby. Uncle Tim gave Kaylin a quiet, unsure pat on the shoulder and mumbled, "Take care, kiddo," before heading for the door. By 4 o'clock, the house was empty again. Kaylin stood where she had from the beginning, unchanged in position but transformed in presence. She hadn't made a speech, hadn't raised her voice, but her story had been spoken. Not by her, but for her. And sometimes that was the loudest truth of all. The boxes came down from the attic one at a time. Old lamps, spare dishes, a forgotten treadmill. Kaylin moved through the basement with the steadiness of someone who knew what stayed and what no longer had a place. The studio she'd built for herself at 23 had long outlived its original purpose. It was never just a place to sleep, it had been shelter sanctuary and silent protest. But now it was time to make it into something more. She rolled up the area rug and stacked the bookshelves against the far wall. Every corner she cleared opened a little more air, a little more possibility. The cement floor would need refinishing. The ceiling tile above the old radiator sagged, and she made a note to replace it. But the bones of the room were solid. She knew that better than anyone. She had patched them herself. By the end of the first week, the furniture was gone, and a contractor named Danny, a quiet woman with a utility belt and no time for small talk, was measuring outlets and adjusting wiring. "You turning this into a rental?" she asked offhandedly as she marked the wall with blue chalk. Kaylin shook her head. "Something closer to a classroom." Danny raised an eyebrow but didn't push. She just nodded and got back to work. In the evenings, Kaylin sat at her kitchen table drafting ideas. She sketched layout plans on graph paper, made lists of local nonprofits, and outlined a curriculum in the margins of a yellow legal pad. Tax basics, budgeting for single-income households, how to read loan agreements without being steamrolled, how to say no to family and not hate yourself after. She thought about the women she'd seen walk into the bank where she consulted the tired ones, the ones who said things like, "I don't handle the bills my husband always did," or, "It's just how my mom taught me I never thought to ask questions." She wasn't going to start a revolution, but she could light a lamp in a basement. She named it the ledger room, because ledgers kept truth. Not just numbers, but timelines, patterns, evidence of choices, like hers had. And because she liked how it sounded steady, simple, unpretentious. The day the flooring went in, she stood barefoot on the new planks, feeling the warmth of the underlay through her heels. She picked up a brush and opened the gallon of paint she'd chosen 3 times and changed twice a warm stone gray with a hint of green when the light hit just right. On the main wall above where the whiteboard would go, she painted her message, each letter deliberate, no stencils. Just her hand and the wall she'd once cried against after learning Jace had stolen money from their father. And no one had told her. Owned, not owed. She stepped back and stared at it for a long while, then smiled. Flyers went out the following week, printed simply just enough for the library, the coffee shop, the bulletin board at the community center where Edna volunteered twice a month. She didn't blast it across social media, didn't add hashtags or QR codes. This wasn't a performance, it was a presence. On the first Saturday in April, 4 women showed up. One was in her 60s, widowed recently, and trying to untangle a mortgage her late husband had refinanced 3 times. Another had left her job after a hostile work environment and wanted to know how severance affected taxes. The youngest, maybe 24, had just started freelancing and said she'd never done her own books. They sat on folding chairs Kaylin had borrowed from the Methodist church downtown, sipping burnt coffee and sharing more than questions. By the end of that first 2-hour session, someone laughed, another woman cried, and all four left with notebooks, worksheets, and Kaylin's voice in their heads saying, "Ask for the breakdown. If they can't explain it to you, don't sign." As the door shut behind the last guest, Kaylin looked around the basement. It still smelled faintly of paint and sawdust, but now it also carried something else. Something like clarity. Like beginning again on her own terms. She wiped down the table, adjusted the whiteboard, and switched off the lights. The painted wall stood behind her, bold and unflinching. Owned, not owed. She didn't need her family to see it. This wasn't for them. It was for every woman who'd been told to just trust, to just help, to just understand. She had understood. Too well. Now it was her turn to teach others how not to disappear. It happened quietly the way it always did with Jace. One morning he was there, his boots kicked off in the hallway, his voice echoing down the stairs as he argued with someone on speakerphone. And the next, he was gone. No shouting match, no confrontation. Just absence. Kaylin noticed first, when the house felt too still. The upstairs bathroom door was ajar, the faucet dry. No used towels balled on the floor. His coffee mug, the one with the chipped lip he insisted was lucky, sat clean on the counter. That alone told her everything. Jace never washed dishes. Never returned anything to its place. If the mug was washed and placed carefully by the sink, he was gone. Deliberately. She checked the driveway empty. No text, no note, not even a single sock left behind to anchor his presence. Deborah didn't say a word. Ewan looked past her at dinner that night, chewing slowly like the air had thickened. No one asked if he was coming back. Maybe they already knew better. Maybe they hoped he would. Maybe they didn't care as much as they'd pretended to. But Kaylin didn't ask. She didn't need to. In the days that followed, she noticed the silence again, not the peaceful kind that filled her room late at night, but the kind that settled in after something is removed, a relief laced with weight. It didn't feel triumphant. It just felt honest. She found the Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen trash a few mornings later, half buried beneath a takeout container and a crumpled receipt. For a moment, she stared at it, the dented metal casing, the faded sticker on the back that read, Vegas or bust. He'd carried that thing like it was an extension of himself. It had thumped through the house for weeks, hip-hop at 9 a.m., ambient lo-fi by noon, late-night indie rock vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat he couldn't settle. Now it sat at the bottom of a plastic bin, discarded without ceremony, just like he'd left everything else. She didn't touch it right away. She just stood there, arms crossed, letting the sight of it register fully. No sentimentality. Just a signal. Jace was never one to leave behind something he thought he might need. If the speaker was trash, it meant he wasn't coming back. Later that afternoon, Kaylin slipped it into a cardboard box with a few other items, an old hoodie he'd left on the banister, a pair of sunglasses missing one arm, 2 burned CDs marked in Sharpie. She drove it down to Goodwill, handed it over to a teen at the back door, who barely looked up and walked away without offering a name. That night, she sat by the front window with a cup of tea, watching the porch light flicker something she still hadn't fixed. She could have. She had the tools. But there was something about that flicker that felt real. Like the house itself was learning how to settle into a new rhythm, one less dictated by noise and interruption, one shaped by presence, not proximity. She didn't tell anyone she'd dropped off Jace's things. If her parents noticed, they didn't say anything. Ewan had taken to reading quietly in the den. Deborah had started spending more time at church. Neither confronted her. Neither asked for updates. And Kaylin gave none. She didn't miss him, but she also didn't celebrate. Jace was a wound that never fully closed, scabbed over maybe, but tender when touched. And even in his absence, his imprint lingered. The choices their parents had made. The years they'd spent excusing him. The silence they'd offered her in return for her labor. He didn't steal from her this time. Didn't yell or slam doors. He just left, like always. But this time, something was different. This time, she hadn't waited for the door to open again. She hadn't left a key under the mat. She hadn't crafted a space for his return. This time, she accepted what the silence meant. She didn't need a goodbye to know something had ended. He'd walked out and she'd let the door shut behind him without flinching. In her journal that night, she wrote just one line. Some people leave like clockwork. Some clocks stop ticking. Then she turned off the light and let the quiet wrap around her soft, complete, and fully hers. Kaylin started with the sink. Not because it was broken, but because it leaked hope. The seal around the base had worn thin, and every time she turned the faucet, a slow drip curved down the back of the basin, disappearing behind the cabinets. She pulled everything apart, valves, pipes, brackets she'd once installed herself with a borrowed wrench and a YouTube video, and rebuilt it without fanfare. Then she moved to the cabinets. The paint was chipped, the hinges loose, one door permanently misaligned because her father insisted on fixing it his way years ago. She replaced them all. Soft close, smooth lines, no squeak, no fight. She worked through the evenings after the last client left the ledger room, the smell of drywall mud still lingering on her sleeves. She didn't play music, just the hum of a cordless drill and the gentle scrape of her sanding block across wood. It felt honest, like a conversation she was finally allowed to finish. The final task was the bulb. It had been out for weeks, but the truth was it hadn't really worked for 7 years, not properly. It flickered, sometimes dim, sometimes off altogether, as if the house itself couldn't decide if she belonged. When Jace was around, he'd joke about it. Still haven't changed that thing, but he never lifted a finger to help. When guests visited, her mother would wave it off. We're waiting for a full remodel, as if waiting were the same as effort. Kaylin had kept it that way for a reason. The flicker had become a mirror. It matched the atmosphere. It reminded her not to get too comfortable. Now it was time. She climbed the step stool alone, unscrewed the old bulb, and fitted in a new one, brighter, warmer. The kind that glowed amber and made even the countertops look more expensive. When she flipped the switch, the entire room lit up, not just functional, but inviting. For the first time in years, the kitchen didn't feel like a place she was merely allowed to exist in. It felt like hers. She stood in the center of the room beneath the glow, taking in the smooth counters, the cleaned grout lines, the soft hum of new light. It wasn't a luxury kitchen, no marble or brass, just honest materials chosen with intention, installed by her own hands. She reached for her phone, opened the camera, and snapped one photo framed from the sink to the pantry, the golden light pooling onto the fresh tile like morning, even though it was nearly dusk. Then she opened a new message thread with her mother. No greeting, no explanation, just the photo, and one line beneath it. You said I was temporary. Turns out I was the foundation. She didn't wait for a reply. She didn't need one. Later that night, she stood in the doorway, a cup of tea in hand, watching the room breathe around her. The house was still. No raised voices, no steps overhead, no echo of someone else's moods bouncing off the walls. Just her, and the light, and the steady, undeniable truth of her presence. In her journal, she wrote her final line for the season, "You can't take someone's place. When they built the ground you're standing on,